Thanks for the invitation. Yes, so I very excited to be here. This is my first talk, I guess, as a new appointee of as an associate professor at Cornell Tech, the kind of Cornell campus in New York City. So I'm very excited of what Jenny Sabin is putting together there and being part of that program, which is starting for me this fall. So excited to share a little bit of where I'm going with the research there. My research problematizes interactive simulations and installations as participatory tools and their affordances to engage the public. My research also interrogates games as a protocol for governance. To what degree a governance protocol, such as a game, is able to create negantropic processes that lead to information-rich patterns. I've broken the talk today into these categories, and I would like to start with this notion, what I've been coining or discussing as an alternative twin. During the 1960s, Buckminster Fuller developed the World Game, an ambitious interactive installation and a series of workshops that aim to address urgent global issues such as overpopulation and the uneven distribution of resources. The World Game was a collaborative simulation exercise where participants would range from students to policymakers and engage in solving planetary scale scenarios. This was significant because it contributed to participatory strategies, framing architecture as a collective endeavor. And in many ways, the World Game offers several key contributions, I would argue. It problematizes design as a collective endeavor. It proposed a game protocol for collective coordination. It links simulation and representation of data as an educational tool, and conceptualizes the event of playing as a social ritual, one that it's embodied, where embodied interactions between individuals had an outcome. As documented by Timothy Stott, the World Game was influential to other projects such as the Eco Game developed by George Mallon, and even projects very close to home. I'm originally a Chilean architect, so this project, Cybersyn, as documented by Eren Medina, a project by Stafford Beer, really conceptualize the notion of how a cybernetic system would actually aid or contribute to the regulation of an economy like the Chilean economy prior to the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. In many ways, Buckminster Fuller's work proposed an alternative to war. It was a time where an alternative to war was important, proposing a collaborative model for redistribution of resources at a planetary scale. Today, we face even grander challenges, I would say, and our digital platforms are perhaps not designed for addressing, they're designed to address competition rather than cooperation. My research echoes and learns from these historical precedents, and I would like to argue that alternative twins are necessary protocols and initiatives that offer new forms of interactive systems, games, simulations, digital environments, digital twins that can foster collaboration, not as a mechanic, but as an infrastructural affordance. So I would like to discuss a little bit how these ideas came to be. As a Latin American designer, I was early in my career influenced by the work of Manuel Casanueva in Chile or Ligia Papé in Brazil, who saw play as a means of emphasizing collectivity, randomness, and improvisation. This would challenge the authoritarian control of space established by dictatorships and their economic legacy. The first project, and maybe this is an old project, but I thought it was important to bring it up, that I was able to kind of manifest some of this interest was with the Bloom project, a collaboration with Alexandra Sek over the 2012 Olympics. Bloom combined a tradition of generative systems and procedural architecture, perhaps contributed from the AA, where I was studying previously, and the legacy of Alisa's work, as well with an interest in social indeterminacy, which became my main area of research. In my view, social indeterminacy would infuse improvisation, nonlinearity, to otherwise a deterministic computational model. I would argue that inextricably, such model would entangle computation with its culture and its audience. Bloom, as I wrote in 2014, was a proposition to reconsider serial repetition, allowing the differentiation of parts to be achieved by combinatorics, the way we permutate combinations between identical units as opposed to differentiating all parts of a system. So in many ways, this model pushes back on the practice of non-standard architecture. These are some of the images how we presented the project prior to its kind of gameplay sessions. This was an approach to afford complexity through affordable means, where serial production could yield inexpensive parts and allow for the multiplicity of different design patterns in the hands of audiences. The open set of Bloom was a non-holistic set that was not exhausted in any way by the different configurations of its play sessions, as we can see in its different locations where it was exhibited in London. My unique take to what we called at the time discrete architecture focused on a socio-political dimension, as the process of recombination would open up to an audience and the public through play. And here you can see how we use Bloom as an educational toy as well. Within the book I wrote, Architecture for the Commons, Participatory Systems in the Age of Platforms, I discuss the complementary relationship that exists between physical systems and the logics of assembly, as well as the participatory platforms that might allow to simulate or kind of create virtual spaces for experiencing this form of massive repatterning or recombination. I would like to expand a little bit on those two ideas, starting with this idea of participatory tectonics. Within the book, I problematize vertical integration. Economically, I think that this is a model that yields or has kind of been instrumentalized to yield monopolies. Technologies such as 3D printing, as demonstrated by relativity space and others, have greatly increased efficiencies in the reduction of parts within assemblies. In a way, you could argue this coalescence of parts, the dissolution of tectonics that we can see in their development. But I argue that this comes with a social impact. In many ways, I argue for a defense of parts, understanding the politics of tectonics. Open sets might yield what we could call a combinatorial surplus, i.e. the potential of the reusability of parts outside their original intention, lending themselves to a kind of unexpected collaboration, so to speak, as I just shared with you the Bloom project, but other projects in a way capture this idea in a snapshot. The Free Universal Construction Kit by Golan Levin and Sean Sims captures how the incompatibility between parts established by different corporate structures such as Lego, Duplo, really define speciated parts that don't talk to each other. And they kind of designed a whole matrix of potential compatibility between those parts. The argument presented in the book was a foundation for participatory design projects such as the Polyomino project that seek a social recombination of physical forms, as in the form of toys, as here in the Polyomino project, as well as through digital interfaces seen here in the early versions of virtual reality that we were kind of starting to experiment how to recombine these units virtually. Attempting to reach information-rich patterns, design patterns that would have perhaps some degree of sophistication. My architecture projects were conceived as building systems that were attempting to organize matter in a particular pattern. This was a way of opportunistically consider inexpensive interventions, such as in the foliage project here, seen here, that really explores how the impact of a singular kind of joint can reorganize otherwise standardized timber members, right? And as you can see here in the creation of a kind of a rather expressive space frame that we prototyped. The projects are certainly conceived as an open-ended set, a finite set of parts that has a kind of an open solution space of combinations. But it also kind of considers the instruction sets, the informational infrastructure that we might need to achieve specific patterns, as in the model that we kind of propose in this case for the Tallinn biennial proposal, as well as tectonic studies of the field conditions that these projects might lead. At this point, my lab was already understanding the relationship that social participation could happen digitally, and thinking that video games was a medium in which we could actually explore such participatory model. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of the second part, right? I would like to kind of backtrack a little bit of what does it mean to think of participatory platforms. As a second argument of the book, I have identified the process of participatory design that can occur digitally and digital platforms. And I see games as critical environments for fostering collective agency, not only in entertainment, but laboratories of social cooperation. The work of Jonah Friedman has been central in conceptualizing some of the correlation between a software, as he developed the Flatrider software project in 1967, allowing for the self-planning of Ville Spatiale. My proposition has been to co-opt the medium of video games as a framework for social engagement, especially due to its affordances to simulate combinatorial strategies. The two completed video games that I have developed over the last 10 years, Blockhood and Commonhood, have advanced in different ways. A public-facing thesis of social recombination, achieved through the study of how algorithmic tools allow to incentivize the production of collaborative commons. Let me start with Blockhood. Blockhood was developed, was concluded in 2017 after 3 years of development. And it proposed a matrix of recombination based on ecological interdependence between city blocks. Players are invited to develop city patterns that interrogate contextual performance. Blockhood pushes back on the idea of any singular optimization criteria, understanding that value systems are collectively achieved socially. In this regard, the algorithm aims to develop a complementarity with its social system, the players playing the game. As a result, play design becomes a form of patterning, not universal patterns, but rather contingent and idiosyncratic patterns that are entangled with the communities creating them. Blockhood was the first professional video game that I developed, and after its release in Steam in 2017, it has reached around 130,000 users, a number that is important as kind of the metric of engagement and reach has been central, and allowing to, this has been emphasized by translating the game into different, over 11 languages. Part of my research has to do with documenting the affordances of the medium as a technical object, and in the case of Blockhood, which proposes a kind of an interdependent simulation and supply chain, and a simple supply chain simulation, invites players to create simple supply chains and kind of start tinkering of what would be alternative versions of different production models, such as in the construction of a industrial food production system or an organic one, and kind of evaluate the different impacts of such models. As well as providing to the player a series of key layers of data, such as structural data, accessibility data, degree of decay of units, as well as productivity, to take decisions within the game. Blockhood was intentionally diagrammatic, offering what Ian Bogost calls a procedural rhetoric, an argument that emerges through play itself. I invite you not to kind of just perhaps judge the game through its looks, but trying them and seeing how that procedural rhetoric kind of comes about. Designed, as mentioned prior, it's a way of patterning information. And discrete units become not an optimal solution, but rather a collective proposition, right, of a value proposition. Here are some images of work that we produce and players have produced with the game. The role of the game as a public-facing agenda, a project that explores the possibility of crowds to arrive to information-rich patterns, a process of negative entropy through social engagement. And as we have practiced through workshops and public engagement initiatives, we observe the potential of it as an educational tool, increasing kind of our kind of literacy on design and systems. Moving on, I want to transition to the second large video game project that I've developed, which is Commonhood. Commonhood takes inspiration on the work of Octavia Butler in world building a setting that exacerbates challenges of late capitalism. And the realism of Diego Rivera, social realism of Diego Rivera, who captures the state of affairs of labor and mechanization within the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, where I've been based for the last 5 years prior to moving to New York. The game was also conceived as my own take on digital twins, particularly looking at the technopolitical history of projects such as Cyberscene. Like Rivera's murals, I was also fascinated by how projects such as Por un Habitar Digno, which is a Chilean collective, have moved from the gallery to the street to really kind of utilize architectural representation to open up an urgent dialogue, especially in the midst of the Chilean crisis of 2019. Commonhood was a second professional video game developed, and it was far more ambitious than Blockhood. It was completed in 2013 after 6 years of development. Together with a license with Microsoft, we reached the Game Pass program, which was significant to reach over 700,000 users since its release. On the one hand, Commonhood is a simulation of self-provision, in a way, a simulation of our kind of DIY cultures in architecture and production, economic management, and thinking that communities could seek stability through how would they kind of handle stability after dispossession. On the one hand as well, and the other hand as well, it's an interactive social narrative developed through over 40,000 words of text and dialogue of cultural struggle, understanding technology, and grappling with inequality. The game simulates the imaginaries of the DIY and the possibility of economic growth through purely through economic means and personal labor. But it creates a conflicting ontology between economic development, and it juxtaposes it with a notion of mutual aid and solidarity, placing the player in a setting that it's not to be resolved, but rather entangling the player and kind of grappling with some of these different kind of modalities of looking at the world. At its core, Commonhood is a 3D modeling tool that is mediated by scarcity. What I mean by this is that there's no copy pasting. You're not operating within a paradigm of abundance where you have infinite lines or infinite pieces of materials. You have to rather kind of work to achieve any piece of material that you utilize within the game and create a habitat. This ontological proposition is borrowed from Arturo Escobar's Design for the Pluriverse, who invites us to consider pluriversality in the notion of a world where many worlds fit. I thought of bringing back a definition that I use with students and in my own work about definition of ontology in this case, and this is again from Arturo Escobar echoing Mario Blaser's definition, where ontology is understood first of all as an inventory of beings, an inventory of entities within a simulation. Second, as the social cultural configurations that those entities might create with one another. And finally, how ontologies manifest themselves as stories. In a way, what is happening in the world, our stories of what is happening in the world are the manifestation of such ontologies. So the social cultural configurations is not only what occurs in the screen, what is kind of represented to the player, but is the symbiosis that the player, as J.C. Licklider would argue, the symbiosis that exists between the player and the software. Therefore, the analysis of the video game as a technical object aims to understand simulation and the entanglements with its human counterpart. Like Blockhood, Commonhood offers a supply chain simulation as a form of, at a much more granular scale, understanding the research being transformed through equipment, machinery, labor, and different forms of capital. The project, it's also an authoring tool for user-generated content, and how do we store that content and kind of transfer that content among players, as well as the dialogue that players might have with non-playable characters, different small, don't want to call them AIs, but simple forms of intelligence that performs tasks or push back on players' interest as well. that need to navigate the world and have their own internal motivations, as seen in some of the decision trees that we have. Central to the project has been to construct a platform for the fostering digital commons. And this is a way in which we both share, like save and share knowledge between players, still in a centralized architecture. That's something that I hope to change in the future. And instead of really sharing meshes and geometry and form, we actually share a particular kind of timestamp data structure of actions that would allow players to fork and iterate of what other players have done, as opposed to really get a copy-paste mirror copy of what already exists within the game. Finally, multiplayer has been central to the creation of this project, not only to achieve and meet some of the expectations of our partners, such as Microsoft, but also to really enable a digital classroom, a digital space where we could actually engage in collaborations synchronously. Commonhood currently lives in the hands of thousands of players, many of which have documented publicly, and their experience engaging with the platforms, not all of them happy, I may say. Seeing in some of these kind of let's play videos in YouTube. But we've also kind of developed more kind of intimate sessions where we kind of like observe and recorded how a particular group of players, this is a part of an exhibition that we did in the Mac Museum in Vienna, where we documented how a group of players co-developed a neighborhood or kind of a site that we kind of orchestrated for, and the negotiation, this is a kind of a 4-hour session that was shrunk into like a 10-minute or 15-minute video, going back and forth on different ideas of what this kind of neighborhood might become. And as well, we continue to use this game as a form of public engagement, as seen in the kind of currently in exhibition in Harlem. I would like to transition briefly and to conclude to more recent work. There's been a reflection on both Blockhood and Commonhood of how their audiences, the relationship of audiences as public has always been perhaps as a passive user. So there was a kind of an interest from my part to really kind of create a much more intimate relationship between the development of a video game and development of a model with the community. So the Detroit at Play project, which was finished recently in winter, proposes a series of workshops and community engagement events that would allow high school students to kind of participate on the production of their own kind of games. And we produced 4 video games that you can find online as well. This was in partnership with colleagues at the University of Michigan, Ishan Singh, Tori Smith, and Salam Rida, as well as community partners such as Diversity in Design and the Boys and Girls Club of Southern Eastern Michigan. And really kind of trying to find what are the institutions that would kind of support. This is Michigan Central, and curator Lauren Ruffin really facilitated the possibility of exhibiting this work in a public setting. So Detroit at Play, it's really thinks that co-development, it's a co-development initiative, really framing simulation as a medium of public engagement, not as a product, but rather as an open model to be co-produced through several sessions. These were two months of sessions in Detroit this past winter. Using an open source library was the methodology that we approach, one that would be open-ended and utilizing kind of the different interests of the high school students that participate in all these workshops in order to co-develop these video games. As you can see here, these are some of the part of a short documentary piece. It's a 10-15-minute documentary piece that we put together to document both the workshops as well as the exhibition. I want to give the stage a little bit to the kids from the workshop to share a little bit with you. And if we have audio, I think we tested this, so maybe they can introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is DeCarla. I am in 8th grade. I'm 14 years old and I attend SOAR Academic Institute.
My name is Emmanuel Henry. I am 14 years old. I go to E Prep Art and Design High School.
My name's Devin. I'm a student at Northwestern, and I'm in 10th grade. I'm I'm 15.
Hi, my name is Isis. I'm 17 and I am a senior at Detroit School of Arts.
Hi, my name is Tyler. I attend Pembroke Academy and I'm in the 8th grade. And my favorite game is Call of Duty.
Video game is arts. It's an amazing arts. And if it's done correctly, millions, no, millions will like come to see it. But also, if it's really good, it can be sensational. Like, it can be generational. Like, people will still be talking about, like how GTA, well, how we still need GTA 6, right? Like, we still waiting on GTA 6.
When people play my game, I want them to think of Detroit. I want them to think of how working together can make a big accomplishment.
The idea of the game is you collect scrap, so then you could make a window or a door or something. You can make a house, medium-sized parts, and you could also sell those medium-sized parts for just points.
Something real from Detroit that's found in our game is just the music scene. So for our game, the music that we've stuck to is jazz music and hip hop music, which are two very prominent music types in Detroit.
It's a game representing Detroit art and the types of murals created in the city.
I chose salvage because I thought it'd be really interesting, and it relates to Detroit because when you go around neighborhoods, a lot of houses are like boarded up and it's pretty deserted, so I thought it'd be like a really good idea considering that the game is based off Detroit.
This representing Detroit and representing one of the things that Detroit is known for, which I think or should be recognized more for, is definitely the hard work they put on their murals. Like, one thing that I want them to take away is like, if it's possible, like, okay, I want to go to Detroit and see some of these murals.
Yes, I think it's very important. Like, there's streets named after musicians. We have the Motown Museum, which is the start point of many great musicians.
Use those resources to make something. You could use some of those things to make a house. You could sell some of those things to make a door to sell.
I think that I like the cats and dogs part, but I think it's just cool that we're salvaging stuff and then making it like new. So we're renewing things pretty much in a way.
Because I got to work with my 2 friends / partners to call on Emmanuel. And Emmanuel likes to try and be a leader when obviously I'm a leader. I'm a better leader than him. I just let him be leader sometimes. You know, it's clear who's the better leader between us. It's like, it's obviously me. And I'm the brains of the operation.
Hi.
So I wanted to leave that in just to kind of give a bit of a glimpse of the dynamics and many of the blind spots that often had to do with like the development or co-development of projects with this group of students in Detroit. The type of methodologies I mentioned was the development of a library that was agnostic. It was a resource management library that would allow students to really kind of add their own kind of meaning, and many of the ideas of the kids really kind of push in many directions the support infrastructure that we were developing. These were some tests that were developed by my University of Michigan students at the time, testing the library prior to its use with high school students, which kind of, without any kind of technical knowledge prior, students were very able to quickly create very simple simulations of waste management. They're all multiplayer simulations that they're locally engaging with, like basically simulating an architectural drawing, bringing some of their own kind of drawing skills into kind of a simulation framework that would allow them to kind of start kind of seeing how the dynamics between players was key for the growth of a particular neighborhood. Some of these projects had to do with waste management, and others had to do with gentrification dynamics. So in many ways, this is the cast of the whole workshop. I kind of found important lessons from the kind of unexpected directions that such a kind of engagement would yield, and like the question of who has a seat at the table, who participates in the construction of the digital models that help us create speculative infrastructures became central for this project. And quickly mention some of the video games, Detroit at Play, this is Detroit Custom Price, and the team behind it, Art Alley, Let's Dance, and Junkyard Mayhem. All of these games could be found in itch.io, and they're free to access them. Central to our interest was not only to develop these games and work with kids, but actually think that the public engagement could actually, the place setting in a way, would move away from the couch or maybe from the subway to kind of become a form of public engagement and a civic engagement. So we really wanted to ritualize play and design an installation that would allow us to kind of really open this conversation of demonstrating what the kids have been working on and open a dialogue with kind of larger public in the city. So this is some of the design of the exhibition at the Michigan Central building, attempting to, again, ritualize play and presenting a project in a public setting. Again, the project really at this stage tries to kind of bring together different communities. On the one hand, we have the students of Detroit at play, their families, the public of Detroit, and together kind of interfacing a dialogue with an academic community that often doesn't have bridges or relationship with the way of thinking of the city with these constituencies. Some of the images of the installation as it was presented in the Michigan Central building. So to conclude, I would like to share an ongoing piece of work. This is the final project that I'd like to share with you that takes me very close to home. The Minga project, or more accurately, this is a name called for the house pulling Minga. It's a traditional ritual performed in the island of Chiloé in the south of Chile. And it's a cultural practice where community members collectively move a piece of infrastructure, such as a house or a church, from one location to another, embodying cooperation, mutual aid, and cultural identity. Minga, it's a long-standing tradition in Chile for reciprocal labor. And it became a central object of study for this final kind of project that I would like to share with you. These are some images of the different instances where this Minga event has occurred historically, and it's an event that it's gradually disappearing. The project learns from critical forms of reenactment, such as Jeremy Deller's reenactment of the Battle of Orgrave, that used the reenactment of the historical event with over 1,000 people. 200 of those were ex-miners and many ex-policemen. I believe that Deller's work materializes a form of enactment as a different form of cognition. In the words of Arturo Escobar, by linking cognition to experience, our authors lead us to an altogether different tradition, one that recognizes in a profound way that the world is not something that is given to us, but it's something that we engage on and produce by moving, touching, breathing, and eating in it. Minga, it's a local multiplayer simulation for 4 up to 12 players, inspiring the traditional house pulling Minga ritual in Chiloé. And it's a site-specific video game that recreates, hopefully accurately, some of the social premises of this ritual. Players can take the role of humans or cattle in the simulation and become part of an assembly that had to work together to move this infrastructure. The catch is that such action, the action of relocating this piece of this house, cannot be performed alone. It's actually something that needs to be coordinated. Therefore, making Minga a form of social experiment of how cooperation emerges within a kind of a game setting. The friction between players is kind of the main mechanic. Understanding that the proximity of players in the room might yield different patterns of conversation, coordination, alliances, team building, and so on. The project builds upon Jonas' styled notion of political theater, considering the site-specific video game installations could become a form of political pre-enactment, or what we could call a form of training for the future, just to borrow Jonas' style framing. As a lab, we're working on enabling the simulation that captures some of the the different actions that we have studied within the ritual. And here's kind of a early, rendition of how, or playtesting session of the current simulation and stance. This was done in the University of Michigan. So thanks again to the TV Lab and Ishan Pal for its support for enabling these kind of playtesting sessions that have been instrumental to understand what this form of interactions can yield, and what are the kind of questions that we can start kind of obtaining out of these interactions. Observing the quantitative and qualitative data of engagement, what we have observed so far, there's several very specific phases that we can see throughout the kind of the simulation, and it often is recurring ones, which is there's a kind of a playful exploration of the game mechanics, understanding the simulation space, or the kind of the space of possibilities offered by the simulation. After a point, there's kind of a sharing of the understanding of such game mechanics among players in the room, as well as transferring that and transitioning to a form of coordination where we can see where teams start working together to execute the pulling of the house. Often this point is interesting because it comes, the volume of the room kind of comes down and it becomes very silent and very focused, so there's a kind of a shift of tone in gameplay. And often that it's kind of also punctuated by forms of correction where players help each other that might fall into a pattern that might not work, and they help each other to kind of correct and continue performing the action until eventually like a withdrawal or boredom, until a new kind of set of players kind of engages with the simulation. And here's some images of further tests that we've done so far. I hope these last two projects, just to conclude, set up a clear direction or kind of give some glimpse of what the kind of work that I'll be doing at Cornell Tech, questioning the settings and communities that might get involved in the development of speculative infrastructure for architecture and design. Thinking both of the affordances of game and play as a form of public engagement and civic participation. So with that, I'll leave it there for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jose, for this amazing presentation. And it's really nice to see your project development progression from early project that is siteless, and then to now the site specific. So for me, looking at your project development progression from early project to today's Minga and Detroit play is gradually giving this agency to the community, to the people who really participate to the platform, and unleash the power of like architect to the communities. And that part, especially for the video from the children, is really nice to see people really engage in the process of you create from these digital infrastructures. And so, question.
Thank you, Jose, for the presentation. It's amazing. I would say as a fairly avid gamer myself, I've always been fascinated by the idea of game mechanics and systems, and it seems like there's a lot of exploration of that in the sort of social context. But one thing that I'm curious about is thinking about of course, games like The Sims, right? SimCity, these kinds of things, sandbox games where you can sort of experiment. But there's always kind of like the idea of the outliers, right? I remember in The Sims, you would build a swimming pool and then have someone go in and then take away the ladder and they drown, and right, this sort of stuff. So I'm really curious about what you think about how to, let's say, deal with or think about breaking rules, right? Since all of these are kind of systems that are set up in a certain way, and even the kids who are kind of constructing their own game mechanics. So how do you confront the issue of rule breaking, I guess?
Yeah, should I repeat the question for the online audience? So the question, I believe, was how do we deal with rule breaking, right? I think that that's an interesting question, and I think about this a lot, especially in professional projects that have a very kind of public audience, such as Blockhood, Commonhood. Game breaking sometimes becomes considered a bug, and you want to avoid that in some degree, just because you can exploit the game. There's kind of many times like money glitches that people get infinite economy, so it kind of breaks the premise of the game. But at the same time, I'm fascinated by the kind of the moments of contingency where a game is played obliquely to the kind of the premise of the game, right? So in Bloom, maybe I didn't include some of those images, but I was always fascinated when players would actually bend the parts and kind of go beyond the intended connections of the unit. And in many ways, there's great books like Ludopolitics and others that explore how games are actually played in alternative fashions. So I'm kind of fascinated by that kind of cultural experience, right? So how do you do that in a way that embrace the kind of the weirdness that might emerge out of like an exploration? I think it's inevitable that if you create a rich enough possibility space or solution space for a game that it has kind of very strict rules, there's going to be forms of expression of players that might be unintended, right? So I think that I would consider that a success of a project that actually enables cultural expressions within the game, as opposed to just kind of trolling the game engine to kind of exploit the engine. So I would very specifically take an approach of patching the kind of exploitation of the engine, but very actively promoting rules that are hopefully open-ended enough. And we see that a lot with physics or kind of simulation mechanics that it's difficult to anticipate all the possible permutations. Therefore, players are the main means by which that possibility space will be explored. And I think that that's what most people find fun. I'm an avid player of all sorts of card games that kind of, if you kind of really start delineating the sub collections, it's impossible to predict all the possible combinations. And the optimization of patterns that emerges there has been kind of central. I kind of equate that process to design. And I think that we do that as architects, constantly. We kind of, in a way, figure out and kind of hack the system and kind of combine things in a different and interesting way. And I think that that's what I mean by information-rich patterns that yield negantropic processes, right? As opposed to kind of putting timber in the same old, repeated fashion. We kind of tend to kind of explore alternative kind of means of organizing those things. And I think that those propagate. So that's at the core of the research, is to kind of pursue those moments and kind of understand how to amplify that in a productive way.
The categorization of some of your work as alternative twin, to me at least, implies that sort of the twin of the real world. And I'm curious if implicitly or intentionally you create some sort of like feedback loop to learn or course correct what you have learned, for better or for worse, from these alternate realities, twins, gamifications, projects, etc., to practice, or if they're conceived more as conceptual projects. Is that built in? Is that incidental to the work? So for instance, did the Salvage video game project in Detroit result in a community rethink around how resource sharing or salvage reuse, etc.?
Right. So I think that the short answer is that has been the curve or the kind of the trajectory of my work since its inception. I think that the first video game, Blockhood, started with a very young version of myself promising that this was in fact going to happen. I remember just talking to press and thinking, well, the kind of the correlation, the dialogue between the simulation and its real world counterpart would be far tighter. But I kind of gravitated to kind of hopefully create a kind of a productive dialogue between a simulation that isn't try or pretend to try to kind of very accurately, maybe as a digital twin would do, to kind of engineer with extreme precision what we would actually have in the real world, but really kind of use the simulation and the permutation infrastructure of video games as a form of more than just narrative, but really kind of tinker with what if we would actually play this way? What if we would organize ourselves this way? Within Commonhood, there was a specific group of people working with the tiny house community, trying to kind of, and the game was very much inspiring that community as well, of how do you kind of take blueprints from Commonhood into the real world. And we want to support those communities. We want to continue expanding on that. But that doesn't mean that the blueprints of the game are exact replicas that you can actually today build, right? I would hope that we would get to that point, but I think that it's premature to suggest that correlation is exact. At the same time, I think when I mentioned protocols of governance, I think that it's much closer to us to simulate how we would kind of do management of resource and resource sharing, or kind of protocols of cooperation that might not require a geometrical counterpart. That's like the engineering of simulation. I think that we are developing projects that kind of are closer to real communities in that extent, and I'll be able to share those in the future. But that's where the project I think is going. It's kind of finding the relationship between this kind of simulation infrastructure and its capacity to echo and kind of facilitate speculation in a far more kind of visual and kind of a way we can tinker it in many ways, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. I had, for some reason I can hear. Okay. I had a question about maybe one of the later slides that you showed in relation to Minga and this player testing and this kind of timeline of interest to course correction to boredom. And I was a little bit curious about how you deal, or what for you might be the objective in kind of negotiating that boredom moment. So is the objective to keep it entertaining up until the point of completion? And how are you, so what's the objective is maybe the first question. And the second one is there some kind of social behavioral modification that you are trying to engineer into the players, or does the game kind of negotiate or have to be readjusted in order to fit into certain speeds of behavioral ways that we are, right? I just simply put like doom scrolling. Is that sort of an aim, or is it more like learn how to meditate and kind of extend your attention span?
Yeah, I think you're picking up on very important issues. I think that if you really look at the body of work, like the Blockhood and Commonhood are big projects that really try to kind of offer a kind of a large solution space. Minga has a very, very small solution space. It's actually like a vector, like a house could be moving one direction, and you think that there would be a target point, like a reward of like we completed the task. It's actually an infinite game. It's actually, you never reach a point. So it reduces the solution space drastically. It reduces the tempo of the game drastically as well. It's actually really boring, right? And boredom, you could say it's pre-engineered because there is no kind of conclusion, right? It kind of plays against the notion of the reward that games have instrumentalized to create addiction, and there's a kind of a commentary socially of what a game can actually be. And there's so much time that you have, let's say, in a setting to play this game and eventually like say, hey, I have to move on, right? So I don't think it's pre-engineered. It's actually like the natural conclusion to a play session. And it kind of places more emphasis on the kind of coordination or encounters or misencounters of, I'm much more interested of when someone might bring someone else in the room to achieve this collective action, right? The kind of, protocols of software in a way that are not written within code, but need to be exercised through kind of voice and dialogue or kind of, and group building. So I think that there's a lot of kind of ideas in that project this is a very small project, and I intended to do a series of these kind of shorter form projects that have different takes on, yes, the gaming industry, the kind of manipulation of what interactive models can do, but at the same time, kind of this question of how does the emergence of cooperation, as studying like Robert Axelrod's The Evolution of Cooperation and different kind of game principles that yield, and how do we practice this idea of building for the future, this kind of empathy for team building and collaborative practices. So I think that it doesn't want to resolve and say this is the way you do it, but rather kind of instigate some of these questions that you're pointing out.
Thanks a lot, Jose. Fantastic. I mean, I love the work, and also I find there's a kind of latent humor kind of embedded in the games as well. And I know you said that we need to kind of look beyond how the games look like, but this is actually what I'm interested in from the angle of computer graphics. You know, and this kind of if I see these the games that you've developed, if I relate them to something like SimCity, it feels a bit on a much more local scale, kind of a different approach altogether. But then just kind of in a lineage of games, SimCity comes out, I think, roughly within 5 years of when the first BIM model is invented, and there's a kind of latent aesthetics that is developed alongside it. And then I'm curious how all the games that you have developed, they have somewhat of a stock game engine look, and I'm sure it's not stock, but I'm curious, like, when you're sitting with your 3D artists, when you're sitting down with all your team, what are the kind of discussions you're having as to how it should look like? Do you want it to be extremely expressive as to the mechanics of it? What is the angle on that?
Well, it's quite, I wouldn't say problematic, but we don't try to make it look stock. So if it looks like that, it's like, oh, you're killing me. So Blockhood, the aesthetic has been, I think, heavily calibrated. Like if you look at the Blockhood, it's a very diagrammatic, has all these playful colors, right? It really tries to index very quickly, like the colors are very, signify transitions between seasons, right? It tries to distinguish features of like different tiles, but also like, a whole series of design considerations. How do you make tiles that are not very recognizable as an entity, but rather kind of when you have multiple of them, they start becoming a fill, or they kind of lose the kind of the clear grid sequencing that was in Blockhood case, and then achieving kind of different kind of differentiation of colors on different angles. There's a whole series of questions of legibility, similar with the UI interface, the contrast, or how do you kind of convey information. So we constantly iterate over that. In the case of Commonhood, I think that it became much more clear that aesthetics and resolution, it's tied to capital and labor. So the resolution of the project had to kind of, it could never be photoreal, because we didn't have a budget for that, and we didn't have, like, it requires so many hours of labor and a team. We were a very small team. We were actually at the core, like 5 people developing the project. So working within an engine for 5 to 6 years, the engines are also changing, right? So we were actually working for a long time on legacy, kind of like the game comes out in 2013, but we're working on like a version of Unity that is much earlier. So there's a kind of you might not be interested in this conversation, but I think it's rather interesting that a lot of the decisions, as much as you have an intention, they also have to mitigate a whole series of other kind of concerns that have to do with communication, have to do with the way in which we're trying to kind of signify a few things, but at the same time have to do with like how do you orchestrate a development cycle, like the amount of funding that we had available and so forth. So, to the best of our ability, the project kind of captures all that, and in many ways, I kind of still reflect on it as I wouldn't just go with all the geometry or all the kind of aesthetic that even in a demo, if I'm pitching a game, I might not put everything that I can do. I also kind of trying to orchestrate what is the kind of team support that I would be able to do, what is the kind of, it considers a series of other things. So I moved to a much more maybe photoreal type of project with Minga. I'm personally interested on the verisimilitude that a project might be able to have, and I wanted to pay respect to the kind of cultural ritual that it's kind of demonstrating. I didn't think that any form of cartoon or kind of simplification of that environment would do justice to the project. Therefore, the kind of photoreal kind of pursuit that is stuck and is using metahumans and is using this kind of already kind of found kind of body assets, but tries to kind of capture or starts to capture in its kind of early development. And this is a project that I'm developing kind of quite with a very small team myself and you know, one assistant in University of Michigan so far. It tries to kind of get closer to photorealism. Just because I think it kind of it's able to kind of establish a dialogue as a form of twinning and a digital twin that is different. So I think that in each project it changes. I'm fascinated by kind of what shaders can do, and I definitely want to pursue projects that move away from photorealism, and I think that's kind of the ultimate pursuit of the project. But the kind of the aesthetic and kind of visual layer, certainly as a communication layer, it is certainly central to the work we do. So you'll hopefully see more iterations on different versions in different projects.
They all look beautiful. It's funny, so I'm a big fan of Zelda. And then when Breath of the Wild came out, I was already looking forward to the next one. It comes out 6 years later, the next Tears of the Kingdom, I think. And it looks exactly the same. I mean, it's a completely different game, you know, and it's a masterpiece, of course. But then there's this kind of idea that there's a continuity, there's a kind of sensibility that sustains it all, like Super Mario as well, Dark Souls as well, like they all have this kind of very specific aesthetics that becomes more important to stay consistent rather than picking up the next newest thing, like Call of Duty, etc. They're shitty games, but they look great.
Just to add a point, and I think that this has been some advice, or like I've been in conversation with colleagues that are also trying to pitch a game to kind of a publisher or you know, go to industry. You could have a very complex and beautiful looking prototype. You know, that doesn't mean that you might be able to kind of publish that ultimately as a, and this happens to video games all the time. Like many games have been attacked by audiences because they don't look like the trailers, they don't look like what they're promising. So I think that having some awareness of the kind of your computational budget, your kind of you know amount of hours that you want to also, like the kind of labor practices, like the way the studio kind of operates. We don't take like free internships or anything like that. I think that those things kind of play a role into the aesthetics of what you could achieve, right? We might be able to do a one-off image or a very short trailer of something looking quite different, but that doesn't mean that that project might be able to reach an audience in a Steam kind of, or reach kind of the public in a kind of in the way in which we've done so far. So I think that those questions become have been more important for me to pursue. This is a game that you can download, that you can play, that you can just engage with the public, as opposed to be a project in a portfolio that would just kind of sit and argue for a game engine type of project. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marcel. Because of time, we are going to move to the next speaker, and I believe there is more question in the audience. We can continue the
Sounds good.
conversation for